Hello and welcome to the rest of the story. We are here in September of 2020, and you just can't get away from the social justice narrative that seems to be all around us. All these words about racism and white privilege, structural racism. Well, this talk is meant to fill in some of the pieces that I just don't think are getting that much publicity. So I've read a number of books from the anti-racist viewpoint, and I felt that there were a lot of pieces of information that were either tainted by their particular viewpoint or simply left out. So as Paul Harvey would like to say, I just want to share with you the rest of the story. Now, in all of this material that I have looked through, I have tried to keep the old proverb or maxim in mind: in all you're getting, get understanding. So that's really our goal here, is to get some understanding from all of this getting, and all of the material provides us with some opportunity to get some understanding, if nothing else, just to understand someone else's viewpoint. Outline. So before we really dive in, I've got a word of caution for you, and it's primarily don't listen to me. All of these books that I have read, they're available for you. So, go read for yourself, read broadly, but think critically. Challenge your own assumptions, challenge the assumptions of the authors, and really keep in mind that whatever you read first may be very convincing. It may seem right, but until you read that other viewpoint, until you really examine that first one, you haven't gotten any understanding. So always examine that opposing view. And keep in mind, I'm still learning myself. I like to say that I have forgotten more than I will ever know. So please, don't trust me and do your own research. So how did we get here to this state in September of 2020 where it just seems like everybody is a racist bigot, and all of our institutions in the United States are racially motivated and trying to squash minorities? As this cartoon illustrates, the narrative now is that race disconnects us, religion separates us, politics divides us, and wealth classifies us. Can't we all be arm in arm like we thought we used to be? All of this division really hit me suddenly. And it was just a little over 4 years ago that Barack Obama was completing his second term as president of the United States. He's a black man. And just look at some of these quotes from his presidency. It's recorded by NBC News. His first presidency, he beat John McCain 53% to about 46%, and 58% of the electorate turned out. And he said, if there is anyone out there who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible, who still wonders if the dream of our founders is alive in our time, who still questions the power of our democracy, tonight is your answer. And then after winning his second election, nearing the end of that term, referring to when he beat Romney, he says, I know because I won both of the elections. And he expressed optimism towards the end of that term, talking about the young and fearless at heart, the most diverse and educated generation in our history, who the nation is waiting to follow. And he said, I believe in change because I believe in you, the American people. So how did we go from electing a two-term black president, and all of this optimism to all of this division. Really, it's been sowed for decades. I was reading some articles from back in the mid 80s talking about social justice. This has been gaining traction mostly in academia now for over 30 years, and it's all coming to a head. But much of it is in the form of books, New York Times bestsellers. And here's one of them called White Rage by Carol Anderson. And it's on the unspoken truth of our racial division. All of this is creating this division. And, it specifically refers to the Black president and says that this white rage has been relentless and brutal as a reaction to the election of the Black president. And, a review from the Globe and Mail says it might seem very conspiratorial and cloak and dagger, but it's also true. All these inventive ways in which the whites in America have been undermining the progress of blacks. And then finally, since 1865 and the passage of the 13th Amendment, every time African Americans have made advances toward full participation in our democracy, white reaction has fueled a deliberate and relentless rollback of their gains. So this conspiratorial thought has been building, and some of it undoubtedly is true. There have been people in the United States who, symbolically have been tripping up people of color. But is it as widespread as they will make it out to be? So that's kind of what we want to investigate. So is this reality or smoke and mirrors? So the first thing we're going to do is look a little bit at statistics, because everybody on both sides of this issue is using statistics. And I know many of you out there are rolling your eyes right now and saying, oh no, it's math. I'm not going to get too deep into it, but we're going to talk a little bit about it before we look at any statistics. Now, I'm a scientist myself, and I've had the privilege of working with many great scientists over the course of my career, one of whom was Geoffrey Lilly, who was knighted in the United Kingdom, and you can look him up. He's got a storied career in aeroacoustics, amongst other things, but he was very fond of saying good data is like gold dust. A well-run experiment that has produced quality data is something that you can build upon scientifically. Now, I came up with a couple of corollaries to this, and the first one is bad data is like fool's gold. You can't build anything useful upon it. So you really need to be careful to make sure that your data is good. And there are ways to test to make sure that it is good. But the problem is a lot of people don't do that. The other issue is, even if you have good data, bad inferences from good data is the gold of fools. And a lot of people make bad inferences from good data. The good data only tells you so much. Sometimes you need a whole new experiment to go down some other path that people want to. So, these are just words of caution about data of all types, whether it be statistical or not. Now, as I was reading a lot of the books on these topics of race, one of them was called Discrimination and Disparities by Thomas Sowell. And he actually starts the book talking about statistics, the same sort of things that I'd been thinking about as I had been reading some of these other books. So I'll just share with you a few of the thoughts that he had in that book. An important point that he makes is that correlation does not imply causation. Now, you may not be familiar with correlation, but it's the idea if you've got two variables, A and B, and they're both increasing simultaneously. That doesn't mean that A is causing B or B is causing A. There may be some other cause of both A and B simultaneously. As a concrete example, we know that young people who travel to Europe have better educational and job outcomes in the long run. So somebody could say that, oh, we just need to make sure that everybody goes on a European vacation. We'll take disadvantaged youth, make them go on a European vacation, and then they'll have better educational and job outcomes. No, most likely people who are traveling to Europe have some other advantage, and that is what is helping them to have better educational and job outcomes. So that's an example of correlation. You're going to Europe and job outcomes, not implying causation. Now, we also need to remember that statistical information, including causation, even if you could conclusively show causation, it does not produce solutions. So first, there may be some unknown variable that you haven't taken into account. And you may not know all the variables and their effects. Maybe all the ones you've measured are simply effects. So if you're trying to get to some particular outcome, like in the previous example, a better job, you may have missed the important causal factor, or there may be a long causal chain and you missed just one in that chain, and so you can't get to the outcome you want. Even if you do identify the correct inputs and outputs, at best, all this will tell you is what trade-off to try. Just like in our previous example, what if European vacation actually was important for getting better job outcomes? Well, the government has to pay for European vacations. There's no free lunch. Also, there may be unintended consequences. In fact, there probably will be unintended consequences. So if you send everybody on a European vacation, at the very least, the federal deficit will increase. But there may be many other unintended consequences because of it. Now, the third thing isn't really specific about statistics, but we just need to be wary of those who are making assertions outside of their area of expertise. And this applies to me too. Okay, so I'm a scientist and I'm going to be talking a lot about historical information that is not something that I would be considered an expert in. I've tried to consult experts, but that's the best that I can do. Well, in all these books about race, we have a lot of people making assertions about statistics, about economics, and they are outside of their areas of expertise, and yet they still act like they're experts in these areas, and that's dangerous. We have to acknowledge our limits in understanding. All right, so let's get to a little bit of mathematics. So what you're seeing here is called the standard or Gaussian distribution. So Gauss was a mathematician, and he observed that most human traits and actually many things in nature follow this sort of a curve, and it can be defined mathematically. So what you're seeing here is right in the center, mu, what we call the mean. It's the arithmetic average, okay? So if I had some human trait, let's use height as an example. We'll use that in the next slide. And we just sampled everybody in the United States, every single person. And then we plotted over here the number of percentage of samples that were a given height. So we have height on this side and the percentage of the population that is that height here. All right. Well, for men, it turns out that the mean is 5 feet 10 inches tall. So that's kind of the average height in the United States. All you have to do is take the heights of every person you sampled, divide by the number of people that you sampled. That gives you the mean. So it's very easy to calculate. There's another very useful concept called the standard deviation. It also is fairly easy to calculate once you know the mean. But what it tells you is that in this case, 68.2% of the population is going to be within one of these standard deviations of the mean. So if I know what this is in terms of, say, inches, I can just add and subtract that from the 5 feet 10 inches, and I know that 68.2% of the population will be within that range. If I go 2 standard deviations, it's 95.4. If I go 3 standard deviations, it's 99.7, and so forth. Now, you may not have been aware that some human traits like height are following this sort of a distribution, but you probably have run across this in school. If your teacher graded on the curve, your teacher was grading based on this. The Gaussian distribution is the curve, and your teacher was assuming that the test scores in your class should follow this sort of a distribution. So your teacher may assume that, right here in the middle, this is a C. And so, 68% of your class maybe is within one standard deviation of that, and they should be getting a C. And people between 1 and 2 standard deviations below might be getting a D. 1 to 2 standard deviation above might be a B. 2 to 3 or 2 and above might be an A. All right. Now, the problem is you have to have a sufficient number of samples before you can have any kind of confidence that you actually get the Gaussian distribution. And often, class sizes of 20 or 30 are too small to really assure that you've got that kind of a distribution. It may be skewed. Now, the other thing is that if you're sort of resampling, there's no guarantee. In fact, there's pretty much a guarantee it won't be Gaussian. So take, for example, say you had taken a bunch of tests and they said, okay, everybody who is 2 standard deviations and above, we're going to put into a select group. Now that select group starts taking tests. Would they follow this Gaussian distribution? Well, no. The majority of the people within that distribution should be closer to 2 sigma. It's not going to be a bell curve. It's this Gaussian distribution. Now it's going to be skewed towards the lower end. All right. And there are other distributions that are skewed that are used in statistics, and you have to know when to apply them. So it's also very important to know when to use each of these different types of distributions. So we just mentioned height, all right? And what we have here are the distributions in the United States of height for females and for males. And these symbols are showing you 1 standard deviation, 2, and 3. So you can see for males, within 3 standard deviations will get you up to about 6 feet 6 inches. So 99.7% of all the males are going to be within that 3 standard deviation range. So it's pretty unusual to find somebody above 6 feet 6 inches. And for a female, it's just a little over 6 feet. So how can we use this sort of information? So now we're going to get into something called probability. And we use this to figure out what the probability, what the likelihood is of some outcome based on all of the factors that are necessary for that outcome. So like if I ask, what's the probability, the likelihood of somebody being an NBA center, I'm going to take all of those factors like height and weight and coordination, athleticism, determination, multiply each of those probabilities together, and that will give me the overall probability or likelihood odds that somebody will be a center. So if I just assume they got to be more than 3 standard deviations above the mean in height, take that, multiply it by the probability that they can have an appropriate weight within 1 standard deviation of the mean. They've got at least 1 standard deviation above the mean in coordination, 2 standard deviations in athleticism, and 2 standard deviations in determination. Well, that gives me about 1 in 17 million will likely have all these characteristics to be an NBA center. Now, all these numbers are just, my guesses, my wags at it. The main point is you have to multiply all these together, and all of the factors must be present in order to get the desired outcome. You can't say that, oh, well, somebody has all of these, but they're a midget. Well, having all of these others is irrelevant if they're a midget, okay? And that's true for whatever outcome we desire to bring about, even if it were jobs. There's probably even more than 5 factors that are important to get a job that somebody wants. And we have to multiply all these percentages together, probabilities together, to get the overall probability. But at the same time, we have to remember that these likelihoods don't dictate the performance of any specific individual. And that's part of what this determination is all about. This just tells us what's likely to happen, what's going to happen on average, but not what will happen for any specific person. And anybody can be unusual and beat the odds. And I think of Spud Webb. He wasn't a center, but he played guard. And despite being 5'7", which is probably generous, I'm sure he was shorter than that, he even won the NBA slam dunk competition. So, even though he didn't have the ideal height, he may not even have the height that you would expected was necessary. He still beat them and was successful. So, we have to remember that, determination plays a huge role in a lot of these. So here are some examples that Thomas Sowell gives in Discrimination and Disparities of how statistics have been misinterpreted or misused. So the first one is one where it was widely reported in the media that blacks have higher infant mortality rates than whites. And this was correlated with blacks have lower rates of prenatal care than whites. So therefore, causation, blacks have lower rates of prenatal care, that's causing higher infant mortality rate than whites. But as we mentioned previously, correlation does not mean causation. And in that exact same study, it showed that Latinos have even lower rates of infant mortality than whites and lower rates of prenatal care than blacks. It was in the same study. And that should have pointed clearly to the fact that the prenatal care wasn't the primary cause of the infant mortality. So I'm not saying that, it wasn't a good idea to get better prenatal care for everybody, but this study did not show the causation that was presented in the media. Another area where the media often will somewhat mislead is they often talk about the wages of the top 1%. We hear a lot about the top 1% these days. And between 1995 and 2005, the wages of those top 1%, their income rose faster than that of others, the other 99%. And the conclusion is the rich consistently keep getting richer. But the problem is the top 1% is an abstract group. It changes with time. In other words, it's not the same Tom, Dick, and Harry in 1995, 96, 97, 98. Tom might have been in it in 95, but then he drops out and Joe jumps in. And then in 96, both Tom and Dick are out, okay? In fact, 50% of those in the top 1% in 1995 were not in it in 2005. And if you squeeze this down even further to the top 0.1%, 75% of those in that group were not in it in 2005. And if you really want to make, these kind of assertions, you need to track individuals, not these abstract groups, because they change far too frequently with time. Now, if we look at the other end of the spectrum, the income of households in the bottom quintile, quintile is just a fifth, so the bottom 20%, those have risen more slowly than those in other quintiles. So we're making the opposite observation. Now, the poor cannot escape poverty. They are just always making less money than everybody else. But again, this is an abstract group. We're not following the same individuals. In fact, it's even more true here. Wage earners in the bottom quintile move up into higher quintiles at a higher rate than from any other quintile. So you're more likely to move up out of the bottom 20% than to move from, say, the fourth one up to the third, or the third to the second, or the second to the first. And that's because many in this bottom group are younger workers just starting out in their careers, and their wages just naturally go up. The people who stay in the bottom quintile often do not work at all. They don't have any income. So, just remember, abstract groups are bad for comparisons. The other way in which this is misleading is they talk about income of households. That's also abstract. So we've got a double abstraction here. First, bottom quintile, that's an abstraction, and now households, because a household contains an arbitrary number of people. I'm a single person, so my household is one person. But you may also have a husband and wife with 8 kids. That's a household. So you're not comparing the same thing when you compare me with that couple with 8 kids. Another statistic that we often hear thrown around is, in a given year, the number of divorces is half the number of marriages. So, hey, doesn't that mean that 50% of all marriages end in divorce? Well, no, it doesn't. Because all previous marriages could result in a divorce, but only single and previously divorced can marry. It's not like every year everybody can remarry. And that doesn't necessarily then accurately reflect how many marriages never end in divorce. If you actually look at that statistic, which is what they're kind of pushing, 41% of all first marriages end in divorce. Now, I'm not saying that that's good, but it's still less than 50%. Now, another word of caution is just about surveys, because we see so many of those being used to support positions. And Thomas Sowell uses the idea of a Russian roulette to get the point across here. Consider that you did a survey about the dangers of Russian roulette. You can only ask people who are alive to fill out your survey. So therefore, you can only survey people who played Russian roulette and survived it. So they are more likely to say that the game is safe. Whereas if you were able to survey those who are dead, they'd probably say it's really dangerous. So Okay, that's about Russian roulette. You might say that's abstract. Well, the same thing happens when we talk about the effect of, say, economic policies on companies. So if I go and survey companies and say, oh, did this government policy adversely affect you? The companies that died aren't in existence anymore for me to survey. And I only ask the ones that are alive that probably weren't adversely affected by it. So it's the same thing. All right, so we just have to be careful about surveys. Now, here's another example, and I'm just trying to point out to you different resources. I've mentioned Thomas Sowell. Coleman Hughes is actually a young black man who is kind of a thinker, philosopher, and he wrote an article called The Case for Black Optimism, but he specifically gives an example of how he has seen different statistics presented in different places to give different emphases. So it turns out that incarceration rates have actually been improving since 2001 for both whites and blacks. And for blacks in the age 18 to 19 age group, there was the biggest progress, and there was a 72% drop in the incarceration rate for black men in that year range. So that sounds great, but you can take that same data and then do a comparison with whites. In 2001, black men aged 18 to 19 were 9 times more likely to be behind bars than comparable white men. But in 2017, they were 12 times more likely to be behind bars. So framed that way, it looks like regress, like it's getting worse. But that's because now you're making the comparison across people groups. Both improved, whites improved slightly better than for blacks. Now, I'm not saying that having the additional information about the comparison between whites and blacks doesn't give you some additional useful information. But if that's all you present, then you're really misrepresenting what the data is telling you. So now I want to introduce you to a book called Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely. So he calls this hidden forces that shape our decisions. And the reason this is relevant for this particular topic, about race in the United States, is because as I was reading some of the books on racism, some of the topics that were coming up were ones I had just read in this particular book, which is what I read just before I started reading a lot of those books on race relations. And in particular, as we just saw, comparisons across groups often cause problems. Well, Ariely mentioned the exact same thing in his book, and the point he makes, and these are quotes out of his book: relativity helps us make decisions in our life. We make these comparisons, we all do, but it can also make us downright miserable. Why? Because jealousy and envy spring from comparing our lot in life with that of others. As an example of this, he talked about meeting with top executives from a big investment company. And during that conversation, the executive mentioned one of his employees that had come to him to complain about his salary. And the conversation went like this: how long have you been with the firm? Oh, 3 years. I came straight out of college. And when you joined us, how much did you expect to be making in 3 years? Oh, I was hoping to be making about 100,000. Okay, so the executive eyed him curiously. And now you're making almost 300,000. So how can you possibly complain? Well, the young man stammered, it's just a couple of the guys at the desks next to me. They're not any better than I am, and they're making 310. And the executive shook his head. So this guy's making 3 times what he expected to be making at this particular juncture in his career, but it was 10,000 less than some other people that he knew. And so that made him upset. All right, so he went on in this conversation with the executive and asked him, what would happen if the information in your salary database became known throughout the company? Oh, the executive said, we could get over a lot of things here, insider trading, financial scandals, and the like, but if everyone knew everyone else's salary, it would be a true catastrophe. All but the highest paid individual would feel underpaid, and I wouldn't be surprised if they went out and looked for another job. And all this, despite the fact that it's been shown repeatedly that the link between the amount of money we make, our salary, and happiness is not as strong as one would expect it to be. In fact, it's extremely weak, and sometimes it's inversely proportional. And studies have shown that in countries where people report that they are the happiest, they're not the ones with the highest personal income. And according to a study by Menchkin, a man's satisfaction with his salary depends on whether he makes more than his wife's sister's husband. Why? Because this is a comparison that is salient, it's relevant, and it's also readily available because his wife probably knows it. All about comparisons. Now, Airlie says that an ironic aspect of this story is that in 1993, in the wisdom of our government, federal securities regulators forced companies for the first time to reveal details about pay and perks of top executives. And of course, their thought was once pay is in the open, boards would be reluctant to give executives outrageous salaries and benefits. And indeed, they had been creeping up. In 76. The average CEO was paid 36 times as much as the average worker, and in 1993, when they enacted this rule, it had gone up to 131 times as much. But based on what we just saw, do you think this would stop what they viewed as a problem? Well, first, was it really a problem? In the mind of some people, obviously it was, but was it really causing a problem to the country? Mm-hmm. Is it one that the government should fix, or should we let economic factors fix it? If a company can't truly afford to pay the CEO that much, then some other company that pays their CEO less should be able to take over the market. What is the true cause of this rise? Obviously, they didn't quite understand it because they came up with the wrong solution. So another thing to keep in mind is that there's all this focus on bankers making so much money, and I've given you a link here for a particular study, and it showed that outside of executive salaries in Wall Street, the highest paying and most secure jobs in banking can be found at the federal bank regulatory agencies. In other words, government employees, where average employee compensation is more than 2.7 times that of private sector bank employees. And there are a lot more of those people than the CEOs. And in 2012, the average salary of a banking employee was 49,000 compared with 45,000 for people with all jobs. So, it's not like there's this systemic problem. All banking employees are just getting paid too much. Yes, it was concentrated in the CEOs, but they went about fixing it. And once salaries became public information, the media regularly ran special stories ranking CEOs by pay. Think of Forbes. And rather than suppressing the executive perks, the publicity made everybody, all these people compare them with that of everybody else, and salaries skyrocketed. And it was further accelerated because consulting firms, they advised their CEO clients to demand outrageous raises. And now it's gone up to where CEOs make about 369 times as much as the average worker. And that's about 3 times where it was before the government decided to intervene. Now, another point that Early makes is that, his whole study on irrational behavior in economics was not viewed very positively by people working in the financial sector. So he just says he hit all kinds of roadblocks. Well, what happened in 2008? Well, that was the financial meltdown caused by the housing bust. And before then, people would tell him, well, I enjoy hearing all of these wonderful stories, small scale experiments, irrationalities. But when things really matter, when people think carefully about their options before they act, they do so rationally. And certainly when it comes to the stock market, when the decisions are critically important, all these irrationalities go away and rationality prevails. So they would say sometimes individual investors make mistakes, but professional investors, at least in the aggregate, act rationally. And there's always got to be some set of super smart, rational investors who take advantage of everyone else's poor decisions and therefore keep the market itself rational. So those were the arguments against Early's research. But then in 2008, with the financial meltdown, even Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Fed, told Congress in 2008 that he was shocked that the markets did not work as anticipated. They didn't self-correct as they were supposed to. He said he made a mistake in assuming that the self-interest of organizations, specifically banks and others, was such that they were capable of protecting their own shareholders. And columnist David Brooks, in commenting about this, said that Greenspan's confession would amount to a coming out party for behavioral economists, that's what Early is, and others who are bringing sophisticated psychology to the realm of public policy. At least these folks have plausible explanations for why so many people could have been so gigantically wrong about the risks they were taking. So I now ask this fundamental question: was it so many people being so wrong, or was it so many people pushed along by ignorant or irrational politicians? And this brings me to the next book. So we've already come across Thomas Sowell. Well, he actually is an economist. And in fact, he's best known for writing a book called Basic Economics that brings all of this math and rigor down to the vernacular where the everyday person can understand it. Well, he extensively studied the 2008 housing boom and bust and wrote this book about it. And he notes that since the 60s, the government, and actually even before that, the government has repeatedly sought to promote home ownership. Since the 60s, mostly among disadvantaged groups, primarily minorities, and most of the time it's resulted in a lot of defaults. Well, 2008 just was a lot more defaults than they'd seen in the past. But he makes special emphasis that the House of Representatives Committee on Financial Services forced through legislation and policies which actually pressured banks and other lenders to grant mortgage loans to people who would not qualify under the previous standards. And they kept lowering those standards, trying to bring more people in. So they were promoting home ownership among people who had neither the income nor the credit history to meet traditional lending standards. They were just assuming that those traditional lending standards could be ignored. And critics warned of it multiple times. And in 2003, responding to some of these warnings, the response was, oh, well, you're just exaggerating a threat of safety. You're conjuring up the possibility of a serious financial loss to the Treasury, and they don't see it. And instead, they said that they wanted to roll the dice a little bit more in this situation to try and allow more people to get homes. Now, furthermore, they leaned heavily on banks to make more loans to people who did not meet traditional qualifications. In fact, they put quotas on them saying you must issue so many loans to people in disadvantaged groups. In particular, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And these are interesting companies because they're a mixture of public and private. So the government sets policy for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but it can actually make profit. And it was through these that groups like the Committee on Financial Services were putting quotas. And again, there were warnings of dangers. And the response was, I believe that we as the federal government have probably done too little rather than too much to push them to meet the goals of affordable housing. And I would like to get Fannie and Freddie more deeply into helping low-income housing. And then the bust. So as I mentioned, they were private institutions that made profit, but they knew that the government was making the regulations and policies, and the government backed all the mortgages. So if there were defaults, the government had to come in and save the day. That was the whole point. Well, after the collapse and all of these warnings and people on these committees having, dismissed them and said, I want to push harder, there was a discourse between a television reporter and a member of that committee. And the reporter said, I saw videotapes of you saying in the past, oh, let's open up the lending. The housing market is fine. The response from the House representative, no, you didn't see any such tapes. The reporter, I did. I saw them on TV. House rep, no, you didn't. They simply denied it, even though it was recorded on television. And their position was simply to blame the greedy banks and their CEOs for their unscrupulous lending practices targeting low-income families, despite the fact they were given quotas to do that very thing. And they recommended slashing bank CEO pay and enforcing stringent new regulations on banks. And for the most part, the CEOs went along with it. Why? Well, because all along, the government was their boss, and they were still their boss. And they also knew that they had only previously done what the government had told them, and that's probably why all of those rules didn't last very long, and CEO pay is back to being unrestricted. So the fundamental question that all of this leaves us with is, can the government really discern the problems? In this case, was too little home ownership amongst disadvantaged groups a real problem? Was that the fundamental problem? Is renting really bad? I've never owned a home in my life. Is that bad? Can it come up with meaningful solutions when there are real problems? It's questionable in some instances. And when it does, will it act rationally? When there are warnings, will it heed them? Now, this is a particularly bad example where the government messed up on almost every level. And I don't mean to imply that the government always screws up this badly. But Sowell identifies many such instances, some are on a much smaller scale where the government just screws things up. And some are issues that are very hot button. Many involve race. Another one he talks a lot about because he is an economist is about the minimum wage. and the fact that, it's like 90% of economists in Canada and 80 some percent in the United States all agree that a minimum wage reduces jobs, especially amongst minorities, because it incentivizes employers to do even more scrutiny when they are evaluating employees, because each one has to get paid so much more. So it's actually going to hurt the minorities the most when you put that minimum wage law in place. But the government keeps doing it. So are they trying to fix the right problem? So there's just many examples. I can't give you all of them. I've pointed you to Thomas Sowell, Dan Ariely. Read the books yourselves. I'm not trying to tell you everything that's important out of all of these works. I'm trying to give you examples, maybe give you teasers so that you go and do that research yourself. Because again, I'm telling you, don't trust me. Do your own research. Be critical, examine both sides. And for the most part right now, I've just kind of given you some preliminaries, laid some groundwork, and next time we'll get more deeply into some of the books on race.